On a cold Friday evening in January, I was driving up to the cabin I inherited. I'd taken the week off to finish handling my mother's estate after her passing, following years of declining health. She didn't have much to leave behind aside from my grandfather's old hunting cabin, tucked away in northern Lower Michigan. Now, over 3 months later, I'd finally settled her outstanding bills and was heading to the cabin around 10 a.m., hoping for a break from the heavy days I'd had. The drive up turned into a snowy journey as heavy flakes started to fall, blanketing the road with about 4 inches by the time I reached the turnoff. But as I pulled up to the property, I noticed something strange. The gate was open, the chains lock cut. Fresh tire tracks led into the property, yet none came out. My first thought was that it must be some local thieves taking advantage of the empty cabin. I checked my phone. Surprisingly, I actually had service. I dialed 911, and the dispatcher assured me that she'd send a couple of units right away. She advised me to wait for them, suggesting that I block the gate with my car and find a safe spot. So, I pulled in, shut off the engine, and waited, thinking about how few people even knew this cabin existed. The area was mostly federal forest, deep wilderness, and not hunting season. Plus, animals like foxes, beavers, and coyotes had been trapped out decades ago. Before I could get too lost in thought, the flashing lights of the county sheriff's cars came into view down the road. I moved my car to let them through, and the deputies pulled up beside me, confirming that I was the one who'd called. I explained how I'd come upon the open gate, the cut lock, and the fresh tire tracks leading into the property. I mentioned that whoever had broken in must still be there since there was no other way in or out. The 2 sheriff's cars crept down the 500 yards to the cabin, with me following close behind. Sure enough, a car was parked beside the cabin, and whoever was inside seemed oblivious to our arrival. The deputies called in their update, noting that the cabin door showed signs of forced entry. Then, just as they finished the call, a man and a woman stepped out of the cabin, struggling to carry a gun safe between them. When the deputies confronted them, the man put on a bold front, insisting they had every right to be there because the property belonged to the woman. They hadn't noticed me until I walked up, and the moment they saw me, all the confidence drained from their faces. I couldn't believe it. The intruders were none other than my former business partner and my ex-wife. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Alexander, or Alex for short burns. I'm 36, divorced, and I own and work as a service technician for a bank equipment company. My job mostly involves installing and repairing equipment like drive-through systems used in local banks and credit unions. I'm also one of the business owners. No kids of my own, but my ex-wife has a young son, and that's part of how this story unfolds. I first met Cynthia Moore on a flight back from Chicago. I was returning home from my time in the Army at the age of 25, having served 6 years as a radio repairman. During my time in service, I'd earned a degree online in electronics with a minor in computer security. I'd done 2 tours in the Middle East and was more than ready to leave the Army behind. Cynthia happened to be in the seat beside me on that flight, and we struck up a conversation. I learned that she was the youngest in her family, on her way back to Grand Rapids from a shopping trip in Chicago. We hit it off, and even as I was retrieving my duffel and barracks bags from the luggage carousel, we kept talking. Cynthia asked if her driver could drop me somewhere, but before I could answer, my mom arrived. After introductions and a quick exchange of numbers, I left with my mom, figuring it was a pleasant encounter but likely over. I hadn't planned on calling her, and honestly, I didn't think she'd ever call me either. About 10 days later, I was at my mother's house when the phone rang. She handed it to me, saying it was for me. I was curious, as I hadn't reconnected with anyone from my high school days yet. To my surprise, it was Cynthia on the line. Right away, she started in on me, complaining about how I hadn't called her. Before she could get too deep into her rant, I cut her off, saying, "I didn't call you. And if you're going to be rude about it, this conversation is over. Goodbye." Then, I hung up, thinking that would be the end of it. Later that week, I went out with a few high school buddies to a bar downtown. While grabbing drinks, I noticed a commotion in one corner of the room. I turned to see 2 guys cornering a young woman who was clearly trying to get away. They seemed to be enjoying themselves, and the bouncers just stood there, not doing a thing. Being the good guy I'd always been, I signaled to my friends, walked over, and tapped the bigger of the 2 guys on the shoulder. I asked, "Are you always a bullying a-hole, or is tonight just a special occasion? If it's always, we'll find a reason for you to stop, or you can leave. If it's just tonight, walk away and cool off." He looked at me like I'd grown a third eye and sneered, "Listen here, you little prick. After we're done with this woman, I'm going to pound you so far into the ground, you'll need a week to dig yourself out." The big guy glanced over his shoulder, noticing my 4 friends standing behind me, and his confidence visibly wavered. He gulped, muttering to his buddy, "Let's get out of here. This jerk's ruined all the fun anyway." Then, he turned back to the girl and sneered, "Listen, if you're not going to play, don't take drinks from guys." Before he could leave, I grabbed his arm and pressed down hard on his elbow joint, hitting the nerve right where it would affect his hand. I leaned in close and said quietly, "How about you apologize to the lady? If you do, maybe you'll get some feeling back in that hand. Otherwise, I'll squeeze harder, and you won't be able to pick up a pencil for a month." He swallowed hard and mumbled to the girl, "I apologize. Guess I had too much to drink." With that, he and his friend quickly left. I turned to check on the girl, and, to my surprise, she snapped, "A hole. Mind your own business." I could have handled it. I realized it was Cynthia, and I couldn't help but laugh. When I finally caught my breath, I replied, "I see your manners haven't improved. Do us both a favor and lose my mother's phone number. I won't be coming around anymore. Maybe after charm school, you'll figure out how not to piss people off." Then, I turned to my friends and said, "I'm heading out, guys. The company over here is a little too toxic for my taste. See you later." I drove back to my mother's house, still fuming. After a restless night, I walked into the kitchen the next morning, and there was Cynthia, sitting at the table chatting with my mother. I immediately turned around, went back to my room, threw on some outdoor clothes, and walked out the front door to cool off. After an hour, I returned to find the house empty, but there was a note on the kitchen table from my mother, asking me to call her. I dialed her up, and she immediately started lecturing me about my so-called lack of manners. Fed up, I cut her off and said, "I'll pack my things and stay in a hotel until I can find my own place. Don't tell anyone where I go. I'll call you once I've settled and have a new car. Then maybe you can apologize for getting involved where you're not wanted." I was beyond angry. This was the kind of rage that could make you want to throw out the whole situation, baby and bathwater included. As I packed, the phone kept ringing, but I ignored it. When I was ready, I called a cab and checked into a Holiday Inn on the other side of town. After settling in, I phoned a couple of friends and got the name of a car salesman they recommended as fair and honest. Thanks to my time in the army and the lack of spending options in the Iraqi desert, I had most of my pay saved up. I called the car salesman my friends had recommended and learned he worked at a nearby Ford dealership. I gave him an idea of what I wanted, and he mentioned they had a couple of Explorers and Escapes that might fit the bill. Since the dealership was close, I walked over to check them out. He showed me a 2-year-old Explorer with the Eddie Bauer package and a 3-year-old Basic Explorer. The Escapes on the lot were a little too fancy for my taste, though I liked the size. Then he said, "I have a companion dealership across town with a plain Jane Escape that might suit you. Only catch, it's a really bright yellow, and no one seems to want it. Want to go check it out? I'll drive so I don't have to split the commission." He chuckled, and we headed out in his car. The Escape was as simple as they come, but had all the essentials I wanted. The yellow was definitely loud, but it didn't bother me. I just needed reliable transportation with 4-wheel drive for Michigan winters. I haggled him down to a good price and left a deposit. Then I took the car to a friend's garage to have it checked out. He promised it would be ready by early afternoon, so I headed to a nearby diner to grab some lunch. When I finished lunch and returned to the shop, my friend gave me the thumbs up on the car's condition, but he recommended getting more aggressive tires for winter. I took the Escape back to the dealer, talked with the salesman, and he arranged for me to get a set of mud and snow tires, including the wheels, at a local tire store. Since I didn't have a permanent place yet, the tire shop offered to hold the tires for a week. After finalizing the deal and sorting out the temporary tags, I drove back to the hotel. With transportation sorted, all I needed was civilian clothes and a cell phone before I could start searching for a place to rent. A quick trip to Walmart the next morning got me some essentials and a track phone. Then, I picked up a newspaper and a local real estate guide from the hotel and went apartment hunting. I toured a few complexes and duplexes, but nothing felt quite right. While driving through some neighborhoods I'd always liked, I spotted a for rent sign on a house in a quiet area. I called the number on the sign and left a message. Just as I started to drive away, my phone rang. It was the landlord. He said he could meet me at the house in 5 minutes, as he lived just a few blocks away. I turned back to wait. When the landlord arrived, we exchanged introductions, and he mentioned that he was actually hoping to sell the house. It was fully furnished, which, according to his realtor, made it harder to sell. Buying a house hadn't been on my radar, but from the outside, it looked pristine. As we walked through the house and around the yard, I was impressed with the condition. The furniture wasn't exactly my style, but it was livable. When I asked about the rent, he quoted a rate that was much lower than anything I'd seen at the complexes or duplexes I'd toured. He added that the first year's rent could be applied as a down payment if I decided to buy. When I asked about the sale price, he named a figure I could afford and offered to include it in the lease agreement if I wanted the option to buy later. We shook hands, he gave me his lawyer's contact info, and I scheduled an appointment for the next morning. Back at the hotel, I called my mother's house and left a message with my new cell number. Still irritated by her meddling, I asked her to keep the number private and only to call in an emergency or if she promised to stop interfering. It may sound harsh, but my mother was still trying to manage my life. A major reason I joined the military in the first place. At 25, a skilled veteran, I didn't need a babysitter or someone constantly offering unsolicited advice. I found a job with a local electronics company, and eventually, I bought the house I had been renting. My mother and I patched things up, and I learned that when Cynthia visited her, she actually wanted to apologize and thank me for stepping in to help her at the bar. I reached out to Cynthia, accepted her apologies, and then moved on. Then, during a service call for a local business where their security system's video recorder was malfunctioning, I had an unexpected encounter. The receptionist greeted me and called for the security director, and out came Cynthia, all business. She led me to the security setup and showed me the faulty recorder. After about 10 minutes, I realized someone had tried to fix a non-existent problem and had crossed a few cables. Cynthia was relieved that the issue was resolved and asked if I'd be open to meeting for lunch sometime. I agreed and found myself looking forward to it. After that lunch, we began dating and continued for about 6 months before I asked Cynthia to marry me. She agreed but explained that there were a few things that might complicate things. Her family not only owned the business where I'd seen her, but several others across the county. She also told me her father, whom she referred to as father, not dad, required her to have a prenuptial agreement before marriage. I told Cynthia that money wasn't important to me, and that if the prenuptial agreement was fair, I had no problem with it. She was curious about how I could dismiss money so easily. I explained that I was healthy, had a good-paying job, a house, a car, and all the things I needed to be comfortable. I asked her why it was so important to have more money than you really need, whether luxuries were so essential that acquiring them became the main goal. She admitted she wasn't sure, since she had always had money. While she wasn't as focused on status and luxury as her mother, she did enjoy the finer things in life. We agreed on an 8-month engagement. However, Cynthia's parents weren't supportive of our marriage. Her mother thought I was beneath them, and her father believed I was after their money. The tension came to a head during a Sunday dinner at their house. They invited a young man from one of their businesses, someone on their social level, and the three of them began making subtle snide remarks about my job. I endured it for about 20 minutes until the young man made a comment about my parents, suggesting they must not have been good if I had to join the army to get into college. That did it for me. I was furious, but I was smart enough not to let it show too much. I calmly addressed everyone at the table. If you think I'm not good enough for your daughter based on the conversation happening here, then I agree with you. That being said, I was raised to treat family like guests and guests like family. I turned to Cynthia and said, if you want to stay engaged to me, don't ever invite me back here again. I asked for my ring back, got it, and walked out. I never returned to their house. Cynthia later told me that the rest of the day was filled with shouting, and the guy from the business had said enough to get himself kicked out. She came over to my place afterward and said we could get married in Vegas if that's what it took. I gave her the ring back, and we shared a kiss, and more, later that night. Things settled down after that, and her father called me about the prenup. I told him to send me a copy of his proposal, and I would review it. If it was fair to both of us, I'd sign it. If I didn't understand something, I'd take it to a lawyer. If it wasn't fair, I would offer a counter-proposal. We could either accept one or the other, or find a compromise. I made it clear that I didn't care about their money and suggested that the best solution would be to put all of Cynthia's money into a trust before the wedding. Then I ran into another problem. Cynthia's father sent me a prenup that was ridiculously one-sided and would have left me in a terrible position if we ever divorced. I took it to a lawyer, who helped me draft 2 different versions. One was just as unfair to Cynthia as the one her father sent me. The other was a much more balanced agreement, protecting both Cynthia's family's assets and my own, mainly my house, business, tools, and savings. The fair prenup also stated that, except in cases of adultery or spousal abuse, any assets acquired during the marriage would be split equally between both parties. If the divorce was due to either adultery or abuse, the injured party would receive all assets acquired during the marriage. I sent back the prenup her father had given me with a note that said, "No way," and sent the one I had made with a note saying, "I will sign this one." I knew that would irritate him, so I waited for his response. When the call didn't come the next day, I was surprised. Then, I received my mail, and the prenup I had sent was returned, shredded into several pieces. I called Frank, Cynthia's father, and laughed, saying I hadn't thought to shred the one he had sent me. I then told him I had a compromise that was fair to both of us and suggested we meet with Cynthia and my lawyer the next day. He came as lawyer. We met, and they requested alimony, which I firmly declined. They also wanted to remove the adultery and abuse clauses, but I stood my ground and refused. They insisted on protecting Cynthia's assets, which I agreed to, but I made it clear that none of my assets from before the marriage could be touched. After much negotiation, we finally reached a compromise that reflected my original proposal. Cynthia and I signed the documents, and we returned to planning the wedding. I hoped this would be the end of the drama and that we could move forward and start our life together. Unfortunately, that was not the case. As I mentioned, I worked as a service technician and was occasionally sent out of town for customer issues. About 3 weeks before the wedding, I had to leave for a problem that was supposed to be a quick fix requiring only an overnight stay. I told Cynthia I'd be back the following evening. She agreed and said she would go to her parents' house the next day to do some last-minute planning with her mother. The issue at the customer site was a simple fix. They needed a line conditioner, which I had in my truck. I set it up and was finished in less than 25 minutes. I could make it back home before dark, so I stopped to buy Cynthia some flowers and drove to her apartment. When I arrived, I rang the bell, and she answered the door wearing a nightgown and robe with smudged lipstick. I handed her the flowers and asked if I could come in. She hesitated, and just then, a man, who was the same one from the dinner, came around the corner, dressed only in athletic shorts, and asked who I was. I became livid. I told the man that I was her fiancé and asked Cynthia what was going on. She said nothing. I took off her engagement ring and told her the wedding was off. I then informed the man that she had been unfaithful. Cynthia started crying, but I simply turned around and left. Later, I received a phone call from Frank, who asked what had happened to make Cynthia cry. I explained the situation, telling him that he and his wife got their wish. I realized she wasn't the right person for me, and the wedding was off. Frank replied that this was not what Cynthia had said. I told him that I understood he had to protect his family, but I would not marry someone who had betrayed me. I suggested he ask Cynthia about the man who was nearly naked in her apartment while I was supposed to be out of town. Frank claimed that wasn't what Cynthia had told him. I asked him why she was spending time with another man in her apartment when we were supposed to be married in just 3 weeks. He said Cynthia had described him as a friend from college. I laughed and asked if he was just a friend, then why was he not dressed when he came to speak to me? Frank apologized and said he would get to the bottom of the situation. I told him to do what he needed to do, but I made it clear that I would not be marrying Cynthia under any circumstances. I ended the conversation there. Cynthia called multiple times, but I ignored them, sending each one to voicemail and deleting them without listening. I then called my mother, telling her to stay out of it, as this was something between Cynthia and me. She said that if Cynthia called her, she would talk to her, but she wouldn't interfere further. I reassured her that, despite everything, I still loved her. We ended the conversation, and I went to bed. The next day, when I came home from work, Cynthia was sitting on the steps of my house. She said we needed to talk. I replied, "No, we don't. You've shown me exactly how important I am to you. We were engaged, and I found you spending time with another man less than a month before we were supposed to get married. We won't be getting married, we won't be dating, and we won't even be talking after today. If you don't leave right now, I'll sell this house and move. Then, I'll make sure no one we both know will ever know where I am. I can't stand a liar and a cheat. Too bad I ruined your little affair yesterday. Did it continue after I left? Was your other lover as good as I used to be? Was it worth throwing all of your parents' plans away?" She started crying again, but I simply walked around her and went in through the back door, since she was blocking the front. She rang the doorbell for about 5 minutes before eventually leaving. I didn't hear from her for several days, but then I received a surprising call from her mother, asking me to reconsider. I explained what had happened and told her to ask Cynthia and get the truth directly from her. I repeated that the wedding was not going to happen. I added, "I'm sorry, but you must have been right." When she asked, "Right about what?" I replied, "I'm obviously not good enough for your daughter." She showed me that by what she did. And just think, if she's pregnant, it's not mine. I heard a sharp gasp, and then the phone line went silent as she hung up. A week passed, and then I was called into the office. My boss and the company owner informed me that they had an offer to sell the company for an amount that seemed too good to be true. I said, "Let me finish this meeting. Mr. Moore wants the company, but I have to leave, right?" George, the owner, confirmed that Mr. Moore was indeed interested, but he added, "No, he doesn't insist that you be fired. He actually asked me to ask you if you would work for him. I told George that I didn't think so, and that I'd write up my resignation letter as soon as I got back to my computer. I also expressed my frustration with Cynthia's family and their manipulative behavior. I explained that I had enough savings to get by for a few months, but I would be putting my house up for sale and leaving the city once it's sold. I also told George that I wouldn't be sharing my new location with him. George seemed to understand and assured me he'd write me a glowing recommendation. I thanked him, then went to my computer, typed the letter, and handed it to him. He gave me my final paycheck along with an additional one, which he said was a bonus for being a great employee. He advised me to use his home phone number as a reference since Mr. Moore would be taking over next week. I asked him not to tell the new owner about my resignation, letting him find out when he reviewed the payroll. In just 2 days, I found a new job, only 40 miles away. When my house sold, through an agent of Mr. Moore, I left and didn't look back for over 18 months. As my mother's health began to decline, I decided to move closer to Grand Rapids. I bought a spacious ranch-style home with 4 bedrooms and moved my mother in with me. We rented out her house, which helped cover some of her medical expenses. The tenant mentioned that a young woman had been trying to track down our new address. I made it clear to him that he should not share any information with her and, if he felt uncomfortable with her behavior, he should contact her father using the number from my old workplace. My new job was similar to the one I had at George's company, but after a year, I realized there was no upward mobility. I had grown frustrated with the lack of opportunities for advancement in the company, so I began looking for something more promising. Eventually, I found an opportunity to invest in a company that was starting to make headway in the bank equipment sales and service industry. I was going to manage the service side, while my partner, Jason Connor, would handle sales. To my surprise, the bank agreed with my plan, and they provided me with a business loan to cover the remaining amount needed to purchase a 50% stake in the company. I worked hard in the field and, over time, found a couple of guys who were qualified and diligent. They were also very security conscious, so we decided to start offering services like combination changes and lock replacements. Business was going well, and on one of my calls, I ran into Cynthia, who was now working as a loan officer at a small bank her father had bought. The problem they had was a sticky safe lock. It only took me about 30 minutes to get the small safe open and another few minutes to install the new lock and set the combination. As we were talking, Cynthia admitted she had made a huge mistake and wanted to get back together. I asked her if she could prove she was trustworthy. She said she had learned her lesson and still loved me. I then asked if she had ever told her parents the truth, or if I was still the villain in the story. She hesitated and said, "Sort of." I stopped her and said, "Cynthia, I haven't stopped loving you, but I will not be blamed for something that I wasn't at fault for, especially when you lied to your parents about it. Would you tell me the truth about that night? I have a couple of questions about what I saw." She nodded, and her expression was a mixture of fear and guilt. She then said, "Yes, I'll answer honestly, and I won't hide anything from you. Can we stop talking here at work? Would you meet me at the diner down the street after your shift?" I agreed, and we set a time. When I arrived, she was already there. I ordered coffee and sat down in the back where she had gotten a booth. She gave me a small smile and tried to apologize once more, but I raised my hand to stop her. I said, "Are you ready to answer my questions? I need complete and honest answers. If I sense any hesitation, incompleteness, or dishonesty, I will leave and I won't see you again, at work or outside of work. If you make me feel comfortable with your answers, we can start fresh. That means dating again, and maybe even an engagement someday. This is your only chance, so use it wisely. Shall I begin?" She gave me a mixture of a scared and annoyed look, but finally said quietly, "Yes." I asked my first question. "Was that the only time you cheated on me after we got engaged?" She responded, "No, but he was the only one, and it was just 2 other times." I followed up with, "Did you have sex with him either that night or the other 2 times?" Her reply was simple, "Yes." I asked the last question. "Will you tell your parents the truth about that guy and how I caught you?" She pleaded, "I can't. Please don't make me choose between telling them and letting you go." I finished my coffee, laid a $5 bill on the table, and stood up. As I walked away, I said, "You already made your choice. I told you I needed honesty, and you're still making me the bad guy. For the last time, goodbye." "Wait," she called out, and for some reason, I stopped. I turned to face her, and she said sadly, "I will tell them tonight." "That's not good enough," I replied. "I have your father's business phone number. I'll call him, and you will tell him now, using my phone and my dialing. Then, I'll call your parents' house, and when your mother picks up, you'll tell her too. Is that a deal?" "Okay," she said quietly. I dialed her father's business number, and when he answered, I introduced myself and told him that his daughter needed to speak with him. I handed her the phone, and she began explaining everything. She admitted to cheating on me, explaining that I had caught her because I returned early. She also said she wanted to clear the air and acknowledge that Nathan was not the bad guy. She told him she was sorry she had lied, but that she had been ashamed of getting caught. I took my phone back and started to leave, but before I did, I said loud enough for her to hear, I cannot accept that she is only ashamed that she got caught and not ashamed of the cheating itself. Your first impression was right, that I wasn't good enough for your daughter, because a vow is very important to me. I apologized for the way the conversation had unfolded, but explained that Cynthia had wanted to start over with dating, and I had insisted she tell him the truth. I hung up and left, but when I saw Cynthia's car following me, I drove to the local library. I entered through the front door, and as soon as I saw her get out of her car, I slipped out the back and drove home. The next day, when I arrived at the office, Cynthia was waiting for me. I told her, I've said all I'm going to say to you. If you don't leave me alone, I'll file a stalking complaint with the police. She left, and I didn't hear from her for a couple of weeks. Then, our company received a service call from her bank, and all of our techs were out on other jobs. I told Jason about the situation, so he called the manager. After he finished the call, he said, sorry, but it was a legitimate request. They have a carrier stuck in one of their drive-through tubes. I told Jason that I would take the call, but if I ran into any issues with Cynthia, I would sell my share of the company and leave. He looked at me and said, God, you're so stubborn. Have you ever done something stupid? I replied, of course I have. My problem is that not only did she do something stupid, dishonest, and disgraceful, but then she blamed me for the breakup. She had a chance to clear everything up last week, but all she admitted was that she was sorry she got caught. I paused and added, I learned before I was 10 years old that the punishment and embarrassment from making a mistake or doing something stupid doesn't last as long as being caught in a lie. I went and cleared the tube, and when I want to get the service ticket signed, the manager tried to send me to Cynthia to get her signature. I said, if you don't sign it, tell me someone besides Miss Moore. Otherwise, I'll go back to my office with an unsigned ticket and we'll bill your bank regardless. If you have an issue with that, we can invoke our 90-day cancellation clause, and you can find a different service company. If you need an explanation as to why I'm taking this stance, ask Miss Moore. I want no dealings with her, even on a professional level. She signed it and told me she would report me to the owner. I replied, I'm the owner. She just shook her head and said, I'll talk to Mr. Moore. We may invoke that 90-day clause. That will be my recommendation. I agreed to that and left, thinking, great, I've just cost the company business by being a jerk. When I got back to the office, I told Jason what happened, and he was furious. He said that if he could get the money, he would buy me out. I was just as pissed, so I gave him the contact at my bank. His mouth dropped open, and he quickly said, I can't run this business by myself, and none of the techs are at a point where they can do your job. Let's just take you off the service call list, and you can just manage from here on out. I agreed to Jason's suggestion, took myself off the service roster, and went home. Later, I received a call from Frank, asking why I wouldn't deal with his daughter. After explaining everything to him, he said he would transfer her from the bank to one of his other businesses. I told him that wasn't necessary because I had already removed myself from the service roster and would no longer be calling on customers. I added that if he still felt something needed to be done, he could invoke the 90-day clause. He said he didn't want to do that, as all the other service groups had done a poor job in the past. I apologized for my behavior, acknowledging that it wasn't professional, but explained that his daughter had pushed me over the edge. I apologized again, wished him well, and ended the call. About 6 months later, I was having a steak with some friends at the local Outback when I saw Cynthia walk in with a group of people I recognized from the bank. She didn't notice me at first, but as she was being seated, our eyes met. She gave a small nod before turning her attention back to her group. She looked a little sad. As my group finished up and I got my check, I left the restaurant. When I got home, I saw I had a message on my home phone. It was from Frank, asking me to call Cynthia. He said, she is so depressed, not eating or sleeping regularly. I called the last number I had for Cynthia, but there was no pickup, so I left a message with my cell phone number, asking her to call. I also made sure my caller ID function was blocked on my home phone, considering everything that had happened in the past. A couple of hours later, just as I was getting into bed, my phone rang. It was Frank, telling me that Cynthia had collapsed after leaving the restaurant and was taken to the hospital. One of the people in her group had called 911, and she had been admitted for a series of tests. I found myself in a difficult position. I still had feelings for her, but she had consistently blamed me for the breakup. I told Frank, I'll think about it tonight, and if I decide not to see her, I'll call you. I can't make a decision right now. Despite my reservations, I ended up going to see her. Fortunately, her parents were there. Cynthia looked terrible, thin, with puffy eyes and a haunted expression. I greeted everyone and then asked Cynthia about the issues her father had mentioned. Her response was emotional. Because I love you, and you dumped me. You've treated me terribly, she nearly shouted. I asked her parents if we could step out into the hall to talk, and they agreed. I think it's best if I leave now, I said. Cynthia is very upset, but I've made it clear that I will not tolerate being with someone who cheated. I continued. The last time I called you, Frank, she was about to tell you the full story of the breakup. I was there, and the only thing she seemed ashamed of was getting caught. I still love her, but until she accepts responsibility for what she did, I cannot have any further contact with her. If this disappoints or upsets you both, I'm truly sorry, but I have to prioritize my own well-being. I hope that one day you will understand that I'm not a bad person, just an honest one. Goodbye. A couple of weeks later, Jason came to me and said Mr. Moore wanted to buy him out. I was taken aback and angry. Jason mentioned that I should have the right of first refusal. I asked him how much it would take for me to buy his share. After he gave me the number, I contacted the bank, and they agreed to hold the loan. I also told Jason to inform Mr. Moore that I was now the sole owner of the company. About 3 hours later, I received a call from Frank. He asked me why I had bought Jason's share. I explained that it was because I could no longer work with him, and if Mr. Moore had purchased Jason's share, he would have likely put Cynthia in the company in some capacity. I made it clear that I could not work with Cynthia. I then asked if Cynthia had changed or added anything to her version of our breakup. He said they hadn't asked. Frustrated, I responded, now that I'm the sole owner, I'm going to formally invoke the 90-day clause. The only other option is for you to buy me out. I then ended the call. I immediately called Jason to update him on the situation. I also offered to sell him his share back for the price I paid, minus 3%, if Frank did not buy me out within 72 hours. Frank responded, saying, okay, I finally understand that, one way or another, you won't have contact with Cynthia. I don't want to lose your company's excellent service. I will buy you out, but I want a non-compete agreement. I firmly replied, no. If you buy me out, I will start a new company in 6 weeks. I'll give you my price, non-negotiable, and I will agree in the sales documents that I won't solicit business from any companies you own. I also won't attempt to poach any employees from your company, but if they come to me for a job, I will hire them. Frank's response was terse. All right, what's your price? I told Frank the amount it would take for him to buy me out. The price I quoted was a 25% premium over what I had paid Jason for his share, which was twice what Frank had paid me for the company. He agreed to the terms. Things continued smoothly for almost a year when I saw an article in the business section announcing that my former company was filing for bankruptcy. It turned out that my new company had taken all of their clients, except for Frank's bank. Frank called and offered to sell the company back to me for the amount of its accounts payable, which was about 30% of what he had paid me for it. I accepted the offer and agreed to honor the original contract with his bank. After everything settled, I became the sole shareholder in an LLC focused on bank equipment sales and service. I hired Jason as my vice president of sales. Both of us made money, and the business continued to grow. Unfortunately, my mother's health continued to decline, and I made arrangements to hire a live-in home care assistant through an agency. Somehow, Cynthia found out about this and called my mother to offer her services. Although I wasn't pleased with the situation, Cynthia had always gotten along well with my mother, so I caved. Cynthia, I must admit, was very good for my mother. Whenever there was a crisis, Cynthia would promptly contact the doctor, and as a result, my mother's outlook improved, and she became much happier. Over time, I found myself being drawn back to Cynthia. I realized that I had never stopped loving her, but I also knew that without being able to trust her again, there would be no possibility of rekindling our relationship. About 8 months into this arrangement, Cynthia asked for an additional night off, beyond her usual time off. She mentioned that she had a date and wanted the time to herself. I said, of course, I'm glad to see you moving on. If this happens again, just let me know, and I'll make arrangements if I'm unable to be here. The night she went out, I realized I was feeling jealous. I tried to suppress it, but I couldn't. After she left, I wandered around the house, unable to focus on anything, until my mother, noticing my behavior, laughed and said, I knew it. You still love that girl. When are you going to forgive her? I replied, I'll forgive her when she tells everyone that I wasn't the cause of our breakup, when I can trust her again, and when she is genuinely sorry for cheating, not just for getting caught. But only when she proves she deserves forgiveness. I told Cynthia that she could have a night off whenever she wanted, as long as she gave me 24 hours notice. She thanked me and assured me that she wouldn't take advantage of the privilege. For the next 3 weeks, Cynthia went out one night each week. One day, while I was out for lunch, I happened to run into one of her friends. I decided to ask if Cynthia had mentioned anything about the guy she was dating. The response I got was a laugh, followed by, "She doesn't have any new boyfriends. She's just trying to make you jealous. She spends those nights out with me or one of her other friends and doesn't even talk to any guy." That revelation made me even more curious about her feelings. I realized that I still had strong feelings for her, and it prompted me to think about things for a few days. Eventually, I decided to explore where things might go if we tried dating again. About 2 weeks later, I sat down with Cynthia and asked her if she had come to terms with the truth behind our breakup. She said that she had. I then asked if she was ready to tell her parents the full story of what caused the breakup, to which she responded that she already had. I asked her if she would be open to starting over, restarting the relationship from scratch. I made it clear that there were some rules we both needed to follow. I emphasized again that we both needed to follow these rules for things to work between us. I laid out the rules clearly. No dates or sex with anyone else. Company functions must allow spousal attendance to ensure both parties can attend. Full honesty about money, plans, and any social events. A prenup that protects both my assets as well as hers. No marriage, or even plans for marriage, until I felt ready. Cynthia looked at me, stunned, and asked, "What caused you to become so stubborn?" I laughed lightly and replied, "Oh, I don't know, maybe a lying, cheating fiancé. Can you think of a reason why that wouldn't upset me?" Her expression turned sad as she said, "Yeah, I guess I deserve that. I'm really sorry and sad that my actions made you change from how sweet and caring you were." I snapped back, "We wouldn't even be having this conversation if I didn't care. I not only care, but I still have deep feelings for you. But that doesn't mean I'll forget the hurt." She seemed to understand, and after a moment of quiet reflection, she asked, "Okay, so are we going to start dating again?" We did, and within a year, we were engaged and married. Cynthia was a beautiful bride. Life was good. Work was thriving. Sales were up, and the money was rolling in. Once we got married, I hired a home healthcare company to assist with my mother's care. Cynthia complained about it, but I explained to her that while she had been the backup plan before, I needed her to take care of me as well. A couple of years into the marriage, things began to unravel. Jason decided to leave the company, and Cynthia began to distance herself emotionally. She started going out for girls' nights out, and our intimacy virtually disappeared. She began complaining about almost everything. According to her, I wasn't successful enough, I wasn't socially active enough, and I just wasn't enough, period. I'd had enough. I told her, either you get an attitude adjustment or you get out. Unsurprisingly, she didn't take it well. Cynthia broke down crying and slammed the bedroom door. Suddenly, it hit me. Cynthia had always wanted to wait to have kids, and I began to wonder if there was more to her behavior. I decided to investigate further. The next day, I went to the office and contacted the private investigation company we used for security checks on employees. John Chambers, the investigator assigned to the case, said he could do a preliminary check within a day or two, but a more thorough investigation would take a couple of weeks. I instructed him to proceed with the preliminary report and continue the full investigation until my questions were answered. John called me about a week and a half later with the news I had been expecting. Cynthia was cheating. She wasn't just involved with my former partner, Jason, but also with the man from the dinner, the one I had caught her with previously. John had obtained explicit pictures, videos, and audio recordings as evidence. He recommended I not watch or listen to the material, as it was very raw. Instead, he suggested I provide the DVD to my divorce attorney. I asked John to make 3 copies of the DVD. I wanted one for my attorney, one for Cynthia's father, and one to keep in my safe, as I didn't trust Cynthia's family or friends not to destroy the evidence. I also requested 5 notarized copies of his written report. I spoke with several divorced friends to find a reputable attorney, someone who would aggressively protect my assets. The firm of Wilson, Lopez, and Taylor came highly recommended, so I scheduled an appointment. I gathered all the relevant financial and legal documents for both myself and my business and met with Kathleen Wilson as scheduled. I provided her with my documents and the DVD, along with the prenup. She was impressed with how well prepared I was and assured me that if the documents supported what I had said, I would retain all my assets, and the accumulation of wealth during the marriage would be mine. She even mentioned that given her own wealth, she would likely have to pay me spousal maintenance, alimony. I instructed her to file for divorce and to seek a restraining order to prevent Cynthia from coming to my business, my home, or contacting me. I explained that Cynthia was often blind to her own faults and would likely attempt to retaliate. Additionally, I wanted to pursue legal action against both men involved, as well as against Moore's business, since Cynthia and the other man worked together there. Kathleen, who insisted on being called by her first name, said, "Alex, I'll take care of everything you've asked, and I'll also find a way to make sure she is forced to move out of your home and have no contact with you unless it's through a lawyer or an officer of the court. Do you know where she'll be, say, Wednesday or Thursday evening?" I responded, "Yes, according to the written report, she meets Jason on Wednesday afternoon, and on Thursdays, she has 4-hour lunches at Ahole's house. They don't return until around 4:45 p.m. to finish their workday. I'd really prefer for her to be served at her father's business office. Thursday works for me." "You're almost as vindictive as I am," she replied. Thursday came, and things were set into motion. Cynthia and her father were served, and my phone started ringing almost immediately. My secretary complained that I wasn't answering calls from either my wife or Mr. Moore. She mentioned that she wasn't hired to get involved in my personal issues. I asked her, "Do you like your job?" She replied, "Yes, but I didn't sign up for this." I, still holding firm to my stance, said, "There's the door to my office. 12 steps from that door is the outside entrance. If you don't want to follow directions, don't let the door hit you on the way out. You know you're only supposed to direct those two and the others I've mentioned to call my attorney. If you can't handle it, look for a different position." She started tearing up and said, "I'm sorry. I'm just so upset that you're mad at me for forgetting about the attorney." That addressed the immediate crisis, but it didn't solve all the underlying issues. As expected, Cynthia filed a countersuit and demanded 50% of all my assets. Kathleen laughed and advised me to place all of my non-business assets into an escrow account. She also mentioned that she had heard from Moore's company attorney, who was offering a settlement. When I heard the amount, I couldn't help but laugh. "Tell the attorney that I'll settle for 15% of the company, with Cynthia and the other person being terminated for cause, and for Cynthia to sign the papers as presented to her," I instructed. "If they come back with any offer that spares him, reject it immediately. But I will settle for Cynthia's signature on the papers, $10 million, and for him to be fired. And of course, they must cover all of your fees, so charge what you need." That's what eventually happened. Then, after my mother passed, things took a turn for the worse, leading us to the moment when I saw the police car. Jason looked devastated, guilty, and nearly in tears. He dropped his end of the safe, causing Cynthia to lose her grip as well. She ended up trapping her foot under the safe, and I heard the bones crunch from where I stood several feet away. She screamed, though it sounded more like anger than pain. Then, she yelled, "You have to ruin everything. Why couldn't you wait until tomorrow to come here?" I was stunned at first, but then the anger took hold, and I became completely calm. Through gritted teeth, I said, "Officer, I want these two arrested on every charge you can bring. I want a court official or an officer to go inside and inventory the cabin for any damages and make note of anything missing. You saw the cut lock on the gate. This woman, my ex-wife, has no claim on this property or its contents. I have the deed transfer papers in my car, and her name is nowhere on them." The officer proceeded to arrest Jason and Cynthia, handcuffing them both before calling for an ambulance. He then asked me to come with him while the crime scene technicians finished their work. We went to a local diner, where the officer mentioned that he had dealt with my grandfather in the past and found him to be honorable and trustworthy. He also shared that the sheriff's department had been keeping an eye on the gate because they knew the cabin was vacant. Once the crime scene team finished their investigation, the charges against Jason and Cynthia were escalated to include conspiracy to commit arson. It turned out that they had brought a stack of newspapers and a small candle, placed the newspapers in the main part of the cabin, and set the candle on top. If the candle had burned through, the cabin would have caught fire before anyone could have extinguished it. Everything that Jason and Cynthia had taken was recovered, the cabin damage was repaired, and the charges were officially filed. Jason pled guilty and was sentenced to 7 to 10 years in prison. Mr. Moore arranged for a psychiatrist to examine Cynthia, and she was committed to a private mental institution. She still had the pending charges awaiting her release, if and when that happens. While in the hospital, Cynthia was determined to be pregnant. The baby boy was born there and placed in the care of his grandparents. I was not the father, and when they insisted on a DNA test, It turned out that neither Jason nor the other man was the biological father either. Despite everything, I still cared for Cynthia, but I realized that life had to go on, and I didn't need the pain and complications anymore. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.